Hey, it's Aaron, the Metal Theologian. I'm just checking because I'm not even sure if I set up all my shit. That's what sort of relaxed today's video is going to be. So I think I'm on a kick because I've been listening to pretty much nothing but Sun Ra again for the last couple days. Been watching the channel for a while. You know that I'm a pretty big Sun Ra fan. But you also have to have been watching for kind of a while at this point because it's been, I've been listening to mostly metal for like a year. You know, it's been a while since I had a big jazz kick. So last video I was kind of talking about how I felt like I was between phases. I think I sort of locked in with the jazz shit. I've been listening to a ton, but then I specifically gravitated towards Sun Ra. So, and you know, part of what I wanted to talk about today a little bit was the different phases because, like we just heard, is definitely an example of the early Sun Ra, which is I really don't know how to describe it. It's because you know it's sort of like big band as far as its sound goes on the surface, but from the writing style and the arrangements, it's so different from anything big band that just to even say that is really kind of lead you in the wrong direction a little bit, you know. You know, it's funny. I was sort of hesitating to play anything in the video because I figured they're pretty likely to put ads on it, but the fact is I don't really mind if the Sun Ra Estate or Marshall Allen or whoever makes a couple bucks off this fucking video. It's not like it's gonna get a lot of views anyway because the jazz video. So here's an example, man. This is part of why Sun Ra is so cool. Okay, this is one of the coolest things about him is that he was really interested. You know, part of this sort of came with the turf, I suppose, of being from Saturn and all that shit, right? But he was really interested in like all these different sort of weird synthesizers and keyboards that came up, you know. So sometimes he'd write things specifically for an instrument and that. But a lot of times he just sort of fuck around and try things out. If you listen to those keys on this, that's a synthesizer I've never heard on any record that wasn't a Sun Ra record. It's called a Roxachord. And I don't know anything about it. You know, it was some little flash in the pan synthesizer in like the second half of the 60s, I think, roughly. This record's like 70, 71-ish, right around there. Actually, I listened to another one earlier. Oh yeah, this one. Well, so this is Night of the Purple Moon. And this is one of my favorite Sun Ra records. I've hyped this in the past. In fact, I think when I did my 5 jazz records for someone who's new to jazz, which aren't like the obvious shit, I think this was one of the records that I picked for that. But this record is loaded with Roxachord too, and in contrast with Night of the Purple Moon, this one is an all-instrumental. And Sun Ra, again, is one of the few where I really dig the vocal tracks, you know what I mean? Just like, this is the antique black, so you probably can't see it at all because it's like a black-on-black cover. There have been a couple different versions, but there's a Strut one from a few years ago. There you can see it says Sun Ra, and it has that funny embossing on there. Yeah, this is one of my favorite Sun Ra tunes, actually. This song is dedicated to Nature's God, it's called. And that's about all the lyrics, too. But I don't know, man. There's something about it. It's just not the same thing as, you know, Stormy Weather or a song like that, you know, or fucking, I don't know, the Boogie Woogie Bugle Boy of Company B, whatever that song was called. You know what I'm saying? This shit just vibes out differently. So the earlier shit... I don't know, man. I'm jumping around. Yeah, this is definitely an example of sort of the small band stuff, because another thing about Sun Ra is, like, he kept the big band going together, and, like, you know, well into, like, the 80s. So we're talking, you know, 50 years, well, at least 40 years after the peak of that style of music generally. And he just fucking kept it going anyway. But he also did some of these, like, smaller band ones, too. You know, he would just do these different things. And these little small band ones are just fucking fantastic. There are a few solo piano records, too, and honestly, Sun Ra's solo piano records don't really knock me on my ass, you know? I mean, there are none that I dislike or anything like that, right? But if you reach out to me and you're like, hey, man, there's this fucking Sun Ra record sitting here, I'm thinking about checking it out. And I go, which one is it? And you go, oh, it's St. Louis Blues. I'll probably go, yeah, man, maybe pick a different one instead of that one, because it's a little bit, you know, it's good. It's a cool record and that. But on the other hand, though, like when he was doing like these big, like weird synth freak outs, like I love that shit. And that's some of my very favorite stuff of his too. Like Sun Ra's band was never like the greatest at just doing pure free jazz too, or free jazz either, I should say. But when they did it right, they did it with gusto. Like Strange Strings is kind of a weak record, I think. You know, it's one where they were trying to like do some like super free shit on frankly instruments they'd never played before, and it kind of sounds like it. I mean, it's a little bit of a joke, I think, honestly. Or you know, maybe to be a little less cynical, you know, maybe just something they wanted to try out, and it was just kind of a failed experiment. When you put out 100 records, I think you're entitled to a few of those. But another thing is that until these Saturn records got reissued for a long time, the only things that ever really turned up were like the ESP records and a couple of European ones. And in fact, another thing about Sun Ra that kind of trips me out is there's a book called Free Jazz by Ekkehard Joost. And the book is kind of considered important apparently because this guy came up with ways of like articulating what people they were doing in some of this free jazz shit. So it's really, he came up with ways of talking about this kind of music that like came into more common parlance, so it's an important book for that reason. But it's pretty dry read, to tell you the truth. I've never made it through more than like half a chapter in a sitting. It's like, it's really turgid, it's heavy on the theory, and I probably know more theory than a lot of people, but I have trouble following it, so just to give you an idea, you know. But anyway, the reason I bring up that book is because there's a chapter in that book on Sun Ra, right? You know, there's like Ornette Coleman and Don Cherry, but you know, there's basically a chapter for each of these specific musicians. And the one on Sun Ra, like if you actually read through it and look at the records that cites, you know, because there's discography for each artist in the back of the book. The ones that he cites make sense because they're the ones that would have been available when he wrote the book in the early 70s. You know, it's basically the ESP records, so the Heliocentric Worlds of Sun Ra 1 and 2, and then a couple of European releases like, what's the one called? With that Bosch painting on the cover. I can't remember the fucking name of it. It's not one of the best ones, though, I don't think. And then there are a couple live ones, too. And actually, those live ones, I think, are fantastic. But the point is, if you don't have access to the Saturn records, you're really missing out on what Sun Ra was about. Because almost all of, like, not so much the weird shit, it's just the cool weird shit was on the Saturn records, you know? There are some exceptions, like, there are those Impulse. There are those records he recorded for Impulse. There were when he signed with Impulse in the 70s, like he licensed 8 of the Saturn releases to Impulse, and those are the ones you see around most with Impulse. But then there were 4 that he recorded for Impulse, and 2 of them were released at the time. They were Astro Black and Pathways to Unknown Worlds, I think it's called, and then there were 2 others that weren't released until kind of recently. And the Symbols, which is one of those 2, I fucking love. Actually, Crystal Spears I absolutely love too. In fact, I think Crystal Spears is the other Impulse one. This is another one I know that got sort of a more official reissue over the last few years, but I actually kind of went out and hunted this thing down. And actually, I'm going to put this on for a minute because it's like there's a weirder Sun Ra. Now, the reason I keep sort of doubling back on myself in my head is I really want to sort of draw the I want to emphasize sort of the true jazz roots of the Sun Ra stuff, because a lot of the records, I feel like the bass line for Sun Ra, and I kind of just figured this out, the bass line for Sun Ra is sort of like that 60s post-bop stuff, the early post-bop stuff. Like the Jackie McLean and the Andrew Hill and the Gratian Moncur and those kinds of records. The ones that were like a lot more sort of adventurous than what, you know, the Art Blakey and Horace Silver had been doing with the straight hard bop, but they weren't like purely free either, you know? It's like they sounded like they were listening to a lot of free jazz. They were influenced by it, but they weren't quite there yet. I feel like that's sort of the baseline for Sun Ra, except instead of a small band like with all of those groups, he had his big band, right? Then on top of it, he also injected a lot more free jazz, you know, way more than any of those guys ever did, even though he was never like fully committed to free jazz, like say Coltrane was in his later years. And then there's the whole overarching concept, you know what I mean? Which I was thinking too, I think Sun Ra might have spoiled prog rock for me. because from the standpoint of musicianship, you can't beat his band. I mean, I'm sorry. I don't care if you're fucking Rick Wakeman or Steve Howe or whatever. You're not going to beat Sun Ra's band. And you know who would tell you that? Fucking Steve Howe and Rick Wakeman. You know? But even like granting that they're just as good, like any musicianship fix that I need, which is, you know, not a lot, but any musicianship fix that I need, I'm going to get from this fucking band, right? The thing has different moods and sort of goes through themes on a record by record basis, but then there's this whole sort of overarching concept, you know? And there are even phases in his career, like in the early 70s, there were those records all about Egypt and shit like that. And there was a lot more sort of straight up space in the earlier 60s, and more about the sun and shit like that too, you know? So there's this whole sort of concept over the whole course of his career too, which he just like delivered. Yeah, I mean, fucking, what can you do? Like legally changing your name to fucking Sun Ra? I mean, how can you beat that as far as being committed? You know what I mean? So any hint of like that sort of like irony, which is the death knell for that kind of shit, is just not in existence. So, yeah, man. So this is like the weird stuff. This is like, and you see, it's sort of free in spirit. But there's some tunefulness in there too, and there's all that shit going on with the drums, you know? There's just this different mindset towards it, you know? Just like taking that style that's really just small band style and arranging it for a bigger band too, because I think that's what's going on. I reserve the right to change my mind. So anyway, Crystal Spears is a great one. You know, this is one that I keep coming back to all the time. This is one of the most like jazz records, okay? If you want to get a record, if you're a fan of like hard bop and shit like that, and you want to hear something that's along those lines, I was gonna say, and you're into like Jackie McLean and you want to hear something more like that, but you don't even have to go that far down that path. If you're just a fan of like, if you've never heard anything more sort of far out than Miles Davis records that he did with his first quartet, you know, the one with John Coltrane, Cookin', Steamin', and, you know, those. Cookin' and Relaxin' are the best ones. Anyway, if that's the most, like, far out thing you've ever heard, this is probably still a good record for you to start with. Because it's very far out compared with those records. And, I mean, obviously the cover, right? And it's all about space and shit. But it's really, it's rooted enough in that shit that when I first sort of went out and tried to investigate Sun Ra, because I'd heard he was nuts and that was all I needed, right? Back when I was in my 20s, before I was really into jazz, I got a couple of freer records, and they just sounded like jazz records to me. You know what I mean? It wasn't like this sort of magical thing. And that's sort of the big caveat I'd have to put out there with Sun Ra, you know? I'm sitting there hyping it and hyping it. If I were on the other side of this here when I was 22, I'd go, oh my god, this sounds like the greatest fucking thing ever. And I would go check it out, and I'd listen to it and go, man, this just sounds like jazz. I don't like jazz. You know? So if you're interested in investigating it, I think it can contribute towards winning you over. But to really appreciate it, you do have to listen to enough jazz to sort of realize how special these records are, too. So, total just ramble video today, right? Anyway, this record is really sort of a cornerstone of the catalog, too, because there are just so many of the songs that, like, he kept revisiting over and over in the catalog. So that was another thing, too. He had no qualms about reprising a song a whole bunch of times, so even changing the names and shit. So, like, Saturn was one of, like, the mainstays. Ancient Ethiopia. And then Enlightenment. Not Enlightenment. Enlightenment. And this is... I think this record was cut in the late 50s. I want to say this was, like, 58-ish. Something like that. But don't hold me to that exact number. And Enlightenment is on this, which was a record store day thing from a couple of years ago. But this actually, even though it's a relatively recent one, it's another Show They Unearthed part of or something from 77. Is it 77? No, it's 73. 77 was a different one I listened to before. And it's called Enlightenment on this one. But this rendition is like, it's completely different. They've like added words to it and shit with this call and response thing, which is awesome. But it's still the sort of bass tune, and like if you heard how the song was evolved over that 15 years between the recordings, it's just awesome to hear. He keeps working at the same time he's doing other shit. So yeah, this is really another one with all classics too. Love in Outer Space and Lights on a Satellite. And then Discipline 2711. What planet is this? I think it's a little corny. For just the weird, like, electronic shit. And in fact, let me put this one on for a minute, because that's what I was going for. This is delivering on, like, the weirdness. This is, I really like this shit. But I kind of want to bring the electronics in a little more. Incidentally, there are electronics on this fucking record, Supersonic Jazz, which is another early one. This is sort of like the brother, sister, sibling record, whatever, to the fucking, to Jazz in Silhouette that I just showed. But this has, yeah, just like India, I think, is the song. But there are a couple on here with using electronics. And again, this is like late 50s, this record. It's like 58 or something like that. So, I mean, just think about that. First of all, okay, so Sun Ra was out of his fucking tree, right? And that's awesome. That makes him appealing, okay? But he was also fucking around with electronic keyboards in the 50s, okay? And not like in a fucking lab somewhere, but like, you know, in a real band that was like recording shit. And by the way, the shit they were recording was on his own private label, Saturn Records, based out of Chicago. Which would have been a big deal anyway in the 50s, but especially as a black man, you know, who had just moved up from the South because of segregation and shit. I mean, I can't even imagine, honestly. I really can't. Yeah, speaking of early shit, here's one that doesn't get shown very often. This is probably a gray market release at best, but this is actually some recordings of him just playing a church organ. And this is the earliest thing I'm aware of, because it's from 1948. And yeah, it's just a kind of an ordinary paste-on cover. And I remember the label sounded really sketch on this one. Oh yeah, there you go. So yeah, this one, you know, if you're really moralistic about that sort of thing, maybe stay away from this one. But it's a trip that, that's fine. I just noticed that it was numbered. 600 copies. Yeah, but it's just a trip. This record, in a way, too, is more bold probably than some of his later records. He really kind of slowed down towards the end of his life, like very close. Sun Ra was really cool, well into the 80s, but the last couple of records just seemed kind of, you know, not as vital as a lot of the earlier stuff. You know, it just felt like he was sort of looking back on his life rather than doing something in space. You know what I mean? Yeah, this is a relatively recent reissue. It's one of these modern harmonic ones. They've been putting one or two out. They're probably about one a year on average for the last few years. And I've been very grateful for all of them, so don't get me wrong. But given a choice between a Fireside Chat with Lucifer, which came out a couple of years ago, and Raw to the Rescue, I think I'd take a Fireside Chat with Lucifer. I actually like this cover a lot less, too. I mean, maybe it's not quite fair when it's competing with, you know, this. But these Saturn covers are just the best, you know? That's a really cool one, too. But this one, again, it's funny because the covers don't necessarily say what they are. This one is kind of more like jazzy. You know, it sounds more like sort of a regular jazz record than like this. That's, you know what I'm saying? I love that synth pulsing in there with the bass doing that shit underneath. It's probably, I don't know how well you can hear it through the thing. You know, it's one thing to just like play an extended jam and everyone takes a break, but to still sort of keep that, you know, that band work going is really, just blows my mind. So what else have I listened to that hasn't been Sun Ra over the last few days, now that we're getting close to 20 minutes in? There's some other shit actually, but fuck it, I'm not gonna bother. I'm just gonna show a couple more Sun Ra's. There's another one I've hyped before. It's another one that's very heavy on the drums. Lots of drums with a lot of echo shit on this one. Yeah, here we have more horns, so I don't know quite say what I expected to with the electronics. You know what I'm gonna do? I'm gonna pick one of the ones with I'm gonna play one since I'm not getting what I'm looking for with the electronics. I'm gonna go for oh, that one track I was hyping off, the Antique Blacks. As soon as I find the enter for this fucking record. Yeah, this record's really cool. It's funny, this came out like in the middle of like a not interested in jazz kick. So it kind of got filed away. And it wasn't this most recent one, so it wasn't even in the stack of shit that I was talking about in my last video. It was just sort of hanging out with the other Sun Ra records, you know? And I do have 100 of them. I mean, I can't turn the camera. It's such a waste to show it. But I actually might do another room tour sometime soon. It's so funny that I'm putting something on with words because I really don't like vocal jazz for the most part. Generally speaking, if there's any singing on a jazz record, I will pass it up. But I don't know, man. I've come around on things that seem more foreign to me than that. So it's just the trappings. I don't like it when the band fades into the background. But when there's just like when there are one or two songs in there with words, like what Sun Ra seems to do, and not just Sun Ra, other people too. But you know, when it's mostly about the music and they're just sort of doing things for the concept or some songs to sort of bring it back, because you know you like something more accessible with your freeform freakouts, right? It just fits into the concept. You know something else I love about Sun Ra, actually? Because I was talking about the quality of the musicianship. June Tyson was a fantastic singer, okay? I don't know who all is singing it here, but Sun Ra, not a very good singer, technically. But part of what makes it so awesome is that the musicianship is so brilliant on these records, but the singing is almost like an afterthought. I mean, clearly it's important, right? But what's important about it isn't precision in the same way that you would expect, in the way that singers usually sound these kinds of records, you know? Just a really simple vamp that this is built off. And these motherfuckers can just pick something like that up and just hang on to it. And it's crazy. Yeah, so it's like the whole spectrum, you know what I mean? You get shit as simple and accessible as this, and then the shit that I just played. That's Sun Ra, man. That's why I can sit here and listen to shit. That's why I can buy 100 fucking Sun Ra records. And actually listen to all of them. No shit, more than once. There are a few I've only played once, but not very many. So yeah, that's about all I've got to say today, man. Here, I'll talk about a new one that seems apropos. I'd never heard of this band before. I got this out of the budget section at my place. Just a 12-inch, it was like $10. I was like, I'll check it out. Sons of Kemet, I don't know anything about them. Fantastic. This record is so good. I'm gonna have to check out an LP or something by him because I want to know more. There we go. Sun Ra's dead, but these guys aren't, so thanks for watching on that optimistic note, right? Take care.